It's 1944, and German engineers are building a jet bomber with wings that sweep forward instead of back, using the fuselage of a crashed American bomber and parts scavenged from a dozen different aircraft. This is the story of aviation's most audacious gamble, the Junkers Ju 287. Stay with us as we uncover how desperation bred genius. We're standing in the ruins of the Third Reich, autumn 1944. Allied bombers are turning German cities to ash, and the Luftwaffe, once the terror of European skies, is gasping for breath. Fuel is scarce, experienced pilots are dead or captured, and the war machine that once seemed unstoppable is grinding to a halt. But in a corner of Dessau, at the Junkers Aircraft Works, a small team of engineers is working on something that could change everything. Led by Dr. Hans Wuck, these men aren't just designing another fighter or bomber, they're reimagining the very physics of flight itself. The problem facing Germany was brutally simple. They needed a fast bomber that could outrun Allied fighters, carry a meaningful payload deep into enemy territory, and do it all while using minimal fuel. Traditional aircraft designs had hit their limits. Propeller-driven bombers were sitting ducks, and even Germany's early jets, like the Me-262, couldn't solve the fundamental challenge of range versus speed. Walker had been studying a radical concept that most aviation engineers dismissed as impossible: forward-swept wings. While every airplane since the Wright brothers had used wings that swept backward or remained straight, Walker believed that reversing this fundamental principle could unlock unprecedented performance. Think about it. What if everything we knew about wing design was backwards? The idea wasn't entirely new. Wind tunnel tests in the 1930s had shown that forward-swept wings could theoretically offer better lift, improved control at high speeds, and superior performance in thin air at high altitudes. But there was a catch, a potentially fatal one. Forward-swept wings wanted to tear themselves apart. The aerodynamic forces acting on them created a twisting motion that could rip the wing clean off the fuselage. But Walker had a secret weapon: desperation mixed with German engineering precision. With the Reich crumbling around them, conventional wisdom was a luxury they couldn't afford. If forward-swept wings were the key to creating a bomber that could turn the tide of war, then by God, they were going to make it work. The Ju 287 project was born from this perfect storm of necessity and innovation. Now, here's where our story gets truly fascinating. Most aircraft projects start with a clean sheet of paper and unlimited resources. The Ju 287 was built like a mechanical Frankenstein's monster, stitched together from the corpses of other aircraft. Walker and his team standing in a bombed-out hangar surrounded by the wreckage of Allied and German aircraft. That damaged American B-24 Liberator fuselage over there? Perfect for the main body. Those landing gear from a crashed Junkers Ju 388? They'll do nicely. Engine nacelles from a Heinkel He 177. Why not? But the genius wasn't in the scavenging. It was in making these mismatched parts work together in perfect harmony. The forward-swept wings were the crown jewel of the design. Imagine watching a bird in flight, but with its wings angled the wrong way. At first glance, it looks alien, almost unnatural. But Walker's calculations showed that this configuration could solve multiple problems simultaneously. Forward-swept wings pushed the center of lift ahead of the center of gravity, creating inherently stable flight characteristics. They provided better airflow over the control surfaces, meaning the pilot maintained authority even at high speeds, where conventional aircraft became sluggish. Most importantly, they allowed for a shorter, more compact fuselage while maintaining the internal volume needed for bombs and fuel. The propulsion system was equally ingenious. 4 Junkers Jumo 004 turbojet engines, the same power plants used in the Me-262, were mounted in pairs under the wings. But here's the clever part. By positioning them forward of the wing's center of pressure, The engineers created a self-balancing system that helped counteract the structural stresses inherent in forward-swept wings. But remember that fatal flaw we mentioned, the wing-twisting problem that could tear the aircraft apart? WOC's team solved it through sheer structural engineering brilliance. They created a wing box so rigid, so precisely calculated, that it could withstand forces that would destroy conventional wings. Every rivet, every stress point, every load path was calculated with mathematical precision that bordered on obsession. This wasn't just aircraft design. It was architecture in 3 dimensions, built to dance with physics itself. August 16, 1944. Junkers test pilot Siegfried Holzbauer sits in the cockpit of the world's first forward-swept wing jet aircraft. Through his canopy, he can see those bizarre wings stretching ahead of him like the arms of some mechanical pterodactyl. In a few minutes, he'll either make aviation history or become a cautionary tale about the dangers of radical innovation. The engines spool up with their characteristic jet whine. Unlike the throaty roar of piston engines, these turbojets sound like industrial machinery, all business and no romance. Holzbauer releases the brakes, and the Ju-287 begins its acceleration down the runway. What happens next defies everything pilots have been taught about flight. As the aircraft lifts off, Holzbauer immediately notices something extraordinary. The controls remain responsive and precise. At speeds where conventional bombers begin to feel heavy and sluggish, the Ju-287 feels alive, almost eager. But our story isn't one of unqualified triumph. The early test flights revealed challenges that would make lesser engineers abandon the entire project. The forward-swept configuration, while offering incredible performance advantages, created a phenomenon the team hadn't fully anticipated: wing flutter at certain speeds. Imagine trying to fly an aircraft whose wings want to shake themselves apart. At specific airspeeds, the wings would begin oscillating with increasing violence, turning the entire aircraft into a terrifying vibrating machine. Pilots reported feeling like they were riding inside a paint mixer. Then there was the landing gear issue. Remember, they were using salvaged components that weren't designed for this aircraft's unique weight distribution and landing characteristics. Several test flights ended with dramatic runway excursions as the improvised gear struggled to handle the Ju-287's unusual approach angles. Yet with each flight, Holzbauer and his fellow test pilots pushed the envelope further. They discovered that the forward-swept configuration offered unprecedented maneuverability for such a large aircraft. The Ju-287 could outturn fighters that should have easily outmatched it. At high altitude, where the thin air defeated conventional bombers, the Ju-287 thrived. By October 1944, the aircraft had completed over a dozen successful flights, proving that forward-swept wings weren't just theoretically possible, they were practically superior. What the German engineers didn't realize was that Allied intelligence had been watching their every move. Spy networks, aerial reconnaissance, and interrogated prisoners had painted a detailed picture of this revolutionary aircraft for Allied air forces. In the corridors of the Pentagon and Air Ministry in London, the report seemed almost too fantastic to believe. A jet bomber with forward-swept wings built from scavenged parts. It sounded like science fiction. But the photographs and technical intelligence were undeniable. The Germans had achieved something extraordinary. When Allied forces overran the Junkers facility in April 1945, what they found exceeded their wildest expectations. Not only had the Germans built a functioning forward-swept wing aircraft, they had been preparing to put it into mass production. The complete technical documentation, wind tunnel data, and structural analysis represented years of advanced research that Allied engineers absorbed like sponges. But here's where our story takes an intriguing turn. The Soviet Union, having captured much of Eastern Germany, got their hands on the most complete Ju-287 prototypes and the majority of the engineering team. What happened next would reshape Cold War aviation. Within months, many of the German engineers were working in Soviet design bureaus, applying their forward-swept wing expertise to new projects. The influence of the Ju-287 can be traced through decades of Soviet bomber and fighter development. The swept-forward configuration would eventually appear in aircraft like the experimental Sukhoi Su-47, proving that Wokke's radical ideas were decades ahead of their time. American and British engineers, meanwhile, took a different approach. They incorporated the structural engineering lessons from the Ju-287 into conventional swept-back designs, creating the mathematical foundations for aircraft like the B-47 Stratojet and later supersonic bombers. The irony is profound. An aircraft designed to rain destruction on Allied cities ultimately contributed more to aviation science than it ever did to the German war effort. The Ju-287's greatest victory wasn't in combat. It was in proving that the impossible was merely improbable, and that innovation often emerges from the marriage of desperation and genius. Fast forward to today, and we're still learning from the Ju-287's revolutionary design. In aviation museums around the world, engineers and enthusiasts study the few surviving components with the reverence usually reserved for religious artifacts. Why does this 80-year-old aircraft continue to fascinate us? The answer lies in what the Ju-287 represented. Proof that fundamental assumptions in engineering can be wrong, even when they've worked for decades. For 40 years, aviation had developed along predictable lines. Longer wings for efficiency, swept-back designs for speed, bigger engines for power. The Ju-287 threw all of that conventional wisdom into question. Modern computational fluid dynamics and advanced materials science have vindicated many of Wokke's theories. Computer simulations show that forward-swept wings do indeed offer superior aerodynamic efficiency in certain flight regimes. The challenge that defeated 1940s technology, structural integrity, has been solved through carbon fiber composites and computer-controlled flight systems. Today's military aircraft like the Su-47 Berkut and experimental X-planes incorporate forward-swept wing technology that traces its lineage directly back to that improvised aircraft built in a bombed German hangar. When stealth fighters use forward-swept control surfaces, or when modern airliners employ winglets that bend forward, they're applying principles that Hans Wokke pioneered under wartime conditions. But perhaps the Ju-287's greatest legacy isn't technical. It's philosophical. In an era when aircraft development costs billions and takes decades, the story of a revolutionary aircraft built from salvage parts in a matter of months serves as a powerful reminder of what's possible when innovation meets urgency. The Ju-287 asks us uncomfortable questions about our modern approach to engineering. Have we become so risk-averse, so committed to incremental improvements, that we've lost the ability to fundamentally reimagine how things should work? When was the last time someone looked at a basic engineering principle and asked, what if we did this completely backwards? The aircraft that was literally built in reverse continues to point us toward futures we haven't yet imagined. Behind every revolutionary machine are the humans who dared to make it real. Let us introduce you to the remarkable people who brought the Ju-287 to life against impossible odds. Dr. Hans Wokke was the visionary, but he was also a man racing against time. As Allied bombers reduced German cities to rubble around him, Wokke worked 18-hour days, driven by the conviction that his radical design could change the course of history. Colleagues remembered him as obsessive, brilliant, and utterly convinced that conventional thinking was the enemy of progress. Then there was Siegfried Holzbauer, the test pilot who risked his life every time he climbed into the cockpit of an aircraft that defied aviation orthodoxy. In interviews after the war, Holzbauer described the Ju-287 as flying poetry, an aircraft that responded to pilot input with a grace that belied its cobbled-together origins. He later confessed that he knew each test flight might be his last, but the opportunity to be part of aviation history was worth the risk. The engineering team itself reads like a roster of aviation legends. These men, and they were all men in that era, worked without proper heating in winter, often without adequate food, as the Reich collapsed around them. Yet they continued refining their calculations, testing materials, and solving problems that should have required years of research. One particularly poignant story involves the aircraft's final flight. As Soviet forces approached Dessau in April 1945, the team faced an agonizing decision: destroy their life's work to prevent it from falling into enemy hands, or preserve it hoping that aviation science would benefit from their discoveries. They chose science over nationalism. The chief engineer, Heinrich Hertel, spent the final days of the war meticulously documenting every technical detail, every lesson learned, every failure and success. His notes, captured by Allied forces, became the foundation for decades of forward-swept wing research. These weren't just engineers. They were custodians of human knowledge, ensuring that their breakthrough would outlive the regime that funded it. In choosing to preserve rather than destroy, they demonstrated that the pursuit of scientific truth transcends political boundaries. The Junkers Ju 287 began as a desperate gamble by engineers who dared to build backwards when everyone else was moving forward. It ended as proof that the most revolutionary advances often come from questioning our most basic assumptions. Sometimes, to see the future clearly, we must be willing to reverse everything we think we know.